Hello, welcome to Modern Papist. I'm Ryan. Today I have John from Project 101, where we're going to talk about Saint Charbel, a Maronite Eastern Catholic saint.
Okay, yeah. No, as far as Saint Charbel, when you and I were talking about different miracles, and I was beginning my miracles project for Project 101, Saint Charbel had a miracle associated with him that fell into every category I looked at.
Oh,
And
wow.
so eventually, yeah, I went down the rabbit hole and found out this guy has, roughly 30,000 miracles attributed to him. And so it became fascinating to me because I was doing research on miracles for almost 6 months before I even ran into him,
Mm-hmm.
which shouldn't be the case. So this is just kind of giving him a little bit more screen time here in the West. So if you're in Lebanon, his home country, you know him on a first name basis.
Right.
But here in the Western right, in the Western church, we really just aren't exposed to him, I find, almost at all. I'd never heard even his name.
Yeah, and that was the case with me too. When you brought him up, I was like, who's this guy? And then I went to a Chaldean church because there's a whole bunch of them here in the Archdiocese of Detroit. Uh, I saw his icon there. Like after we talked, I was like, oh my gosh, there he is. And even though he's not in the Chaldean rite, he like it doesn't seem to matter with the Eastern Rite Catholics in terms of like as long as they're a saint in the an Eastern saint, like they're gonna be venerated
Right.
because they're a saint, and so it doesn't matter. But for whatever reason, it just takes forever for us to get there. Um,
Well, and I didn't do a lot of study into the exact differences between how the Catholic Church declares its saints versus saints being declared locally, because there are two different processes, especially when
right.
it comes to different rites of the church. So I don't know all the ins and outs of the exact politics, but I know that there was politics. well, well, yeah. So what we'll do, we'll just get into his life story very basically, and then get into all of the miracles.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, and this is really, really basic coverage of him. I would definitely go look up. There's some different documentaries, even some films made on his life. But very basically, born in 1828, one of five kids in a small mountain town in Lebanon.
Mhm.
Um, in When he was 3 years old, his father was pressed into military service and died. And his mother remarried a man who went on to become a parish priest. So it's a very pious family.
Mhm.
He grew up in the Maronite Catholic rite, and he was drawn to becoming a hermit because his two uncles were actually already religious. And he actually set up an icon to the Virgin Mary out where he would pasture cows. So from a very, very young age, this was kind of the direction that he wanted to go. When he was 23, he left his home. He didn't tell anybody, and just went and joined a monastery. And he took the name Sharbel after a second century Christian martyr. He
Oh.
studied philosophy theology. He, under another saint, and I'm going to butcher this name, so I'm going to call him Saint Kassab, because there's no way I'm going to get his first name right. Um, and he became a priest 1859. He worked with his hands a lot in his monastic life. He even aided injured soldiers with basic medical care. He was actually witness to one of the Islamic attacks on Christians in Lebanon that killed 20,000 Christians in his lifetime. In 1875, he was approved to become a hermit. And so for the last 23 years of his life, he did fasting and prayer, and he kind of became known around the town for his severe ascetic lifestyle. Basically, the miracles in his lifetime, he would pray for people and they would get better. But big ones that I found mention of were actually nature miracles, where he was able to drive away like a violent serpent in one case. He was able to drive away locusts to the point that people would have him pray over their fields so
Yeah.
that they would be free of bugs. Um, they just talked a lot about him. Whenever there was an issue, they would go to this weird hermit guy, bring him out, he would pray, the problem would go away, and then they would put him back in his, little hole to pray again. In his order too, he was actually buried in an unmarked grave. They have like an extreme poverty that they put themselves through. That being said, Saint Charbel's miracles begin almost immediately after his death. Right off the bat, there was apparently a glowing light coming from his grave for about 45 days after he died before it faded. And so there were actually people trying to rob his grave, which is why they moved him from the unmarked grave into different locations, and ultimately the current location of his tomb. There was speculation that he was incorruptible, and I don't really want to touch into that too much because there are kind of conflicting accounts. But he is completely decayed as of now, is my understanding. So there were some reports that he remained undecayed for a couple decades or whatever have you, but that's not really the kind of miracle stuff that I want to focus on. But yeah, so after his death, weird stuff starts happening. People start declaring that he was a saint. And then the miracles more or less start pouring in almost immediately. People going to his gravesite and praying, people going to the site of his tomb after he was moved and praying, and then them just getting miraculously healed. So we have a couple of different examples of that, and then just kind of some interesting observations. But anyway, I'm going to stop if you have any questions, comments, anything like that.
Well, I just think it's fascinating that even when he was put into an unmarked grave, which is, probably the most basic way you could be buried, even after that was slowly decayed a few decades later, like you said. I just find that interesting, but but there's a lot more in terms of incorruptible bodies. That's a bigger discussion for another day.
Right.
So
I just I don't put a lot of, you got to have at least 100 years under your belt before I start putting stock in it or anything. So
right.
But yeah, I mean, he was in an unmarked grave. Apparently they took his corpse out of mud. So I mean, it really, from what my understanding is that he should have decayed almost immediately, and that he didn't. And so there are some videos of him being exhumed in the 1950s, but it's on a very old set of cameras in Lebanon in a tomb. It's interesting, but I think more interesting are the miracles that have surrounded him. So since his death in 1898, there have been between, depending on which reports, 26,000 and 33,000 miracles attributed to him, which works out to more than one every other day for the last 122 years or 124 years. Yeah, so that's like absurd. Saint Charbel is known by Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the area. Muslims will actually claim that they pray and are healed by Saint Charbel. I mean, in Lebanon, like we had talked about before, is 60% Muslim. So for them, for a non-Catholic, not even a Christian group to say, oh yeah, Saint Charbel is obviously in heaven and answering prayers is a pretty astounding feat. But I want to talk about some of those miracles, but just the raw number, I think, should give anybody pause. And those are testimonies collected by the monks themselves. So there may be 10 times that many, and we just don't know.
Right. My only concern is when you start throwing like numbers out like that, it kind of reminds me of Lourdes, where Lourdes had a lot of unconfirmed miracles where people were being healed of like mental illness and things you couldn't really validate. And don't get me wrong, like, what is it? I think there's like 70 or 80 miracles that have been validated and have been 71. So like
so.
that, those are different than what a lot of people initially were saying. And I think that's my only hesitation, is like, because I'm not one of those people that will say, well, a saint did like these 50 billion miracles. And it's like, okay, I have a few questions.
Right.
And like that's kind of where I start, because like the miracle, like at the end of the day, miracles seem to be more for those that don't believe and not for those that believe. And some people seem to think that it's okay to fake them.
Yeah.
And that's and it gives a false hope. And that's what I really have an issue with.
Right. So my thoughts on that, I kind of cut it both ways. So as far as Lords go, there are 7,000 miracles reported and only 70 approved. So it works out like to right at 1%.
Mm-hmm.
But of those 7,000, my understanding is that 2,500 don't have an explanation. They
Mm-hmm.
just either don't have enough documentation, enough people signed off, or enough evidence to confirm. So because Lords is so stringent, so and then the people that don't go to get medically evaluated, or don't keep up with being medically evaluated, or die of some other random cause before the time period. Like, so for instance, in one of the cases at Lords, they had a man who was healed of multiple sclerosis, and so the longest case that they had of multiple sclerosis going into submission was 6 years. So they made him wait 12 years before declaring it a miracle, double the
Right.
time of any case that had happened.
Oh,
Well, he
they've
had
gotten a
gotten hit
lot.
by.
Yeah. Yeah, they've gotten really good with it at Lords. I'm just saying in terms of like
Right,
the initial explosion of claims.
right.
Like there's a lot of, people who just claim it. And so like that's why when it comes to like this, I think any reasonable person should ask, because we don't want to put stock into something that's like, that's all I'm saying, is we don't want to put stock
Sure,
into something
sure.
that isn't real.
Right. And but I'm also hesitant on the other sense, and just because whenever you dialogue with atheists about miracles, they'll go, "Well, Lord's only has 70 miracles," and it's like, no, it has multiple thousands of miracles. It's just whether or not they meet the church's stringent standards.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, with Saint Charbel, I looked through dozens of the cases that they had, and some of them were like, I was bipolar or depressed, or had these major mental issues, and then got better instantly. And it's like, yes, you could debate that has a neurological explanation or something along those lines.
Right.
But the ones used for his canonization and his most popular miracles are a lot harder to explain. So
Yes.
I want to dive into a couple of those, just so we can kind of see a little bit of what's going on.